Good evening, everyone. Is the sound okay? A bit of a ring, isn't it, going on? That's better. Is that all right now? Fine. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, first of all, for that really wonderful gongyo. It's not often these days we can gather together, so many of us, and do gongyo together. But it's well, for me anyway, it's a wonderful feeling, and I hope it is for you too. So this evening, I'm going to lecture to you on the 26 admonitions of Nikko Shonin. Nikko Shonin, the second high priest, the successor to Nichiren Shonin himself. And this lecture I've already given once, for the first time in Devon and Cornwall, just a week or so ago. And it's going to be done in other areas of the UK, because I feel it's so incredibly important to us at this particular point in time. And I hope what I'm going to say will help you to feel the same as I do. So these 26 admonitions, admonition meaning, as you I'm sure know, warning, were written by Nikko Shonin, the second high priest, who we express our gratitude to every day in the third prayer of Gongyo. And they were written by him on the 13th of January, 1333. All threes, 1333, the 13th of January. And this was just 20 days before he died at the great old age, very great old age in those days, of 88 years old. Because in those days, the average age in Japan, I haven't been able to check it, but most likely it was not dissimilar to the average age in Britain at that time, which was somewhere between 40 and 50, though I haven't been able to find the exact figure for that particular year, but somewhere between 40 and 50 years. So to live to 88 was really quite an achievement, whereas today, quite lots of people live to 88. So he actually died, as I say, 20 days after he'd written these most important 26 warnings. He died on the 7th of February. So next February, being February 1993, the 7th of February will be the 660th anniversary of Nikko Shonin's death. He actually made these warnings to give you a sort of time count 51 years after Nichiren Shonin had died. And remembering that he was a close disciple of Nichiren Shonin gives you an idea of the age which he reached, 51 years after Nichiren Shonin's death. So these 26 warnings have already been of extraordinary importance, really, to us in challenging all the problems of the head temple, because their existence gives us absolute concrete proof of Nichiren and his followers' slanderous actions. Furthermore, I think it's worth noting in this respect that Nikko Shonin's action in writing these admonitions to the priests, I emphasize, they were originally to the priests, in those days was his very deep concern, obviously, about what would go on after his death. And his concern is expressed in each one of these 26 articles. And it's very clear that since he wrote these to the priests, he was very sure that at some point the priests would again prove to be the enemy of true Buddhism. The worms, in other words, in the bowels of the lion, as Nichiren Shonin put it. Because one must, of course, remember that he'd already had to cope with the problem of the 5 elder priests. 5 elder priests who deserted Nikko after Nichiren Shonin died, and failed even to keep the nightly watch over the grave of his master, Nichiren Daishonin. They went off in various directions and founded various heretical sects. In other words, for one reason or another, they had not understood or they didn't wish to understand Nichiren Daishonin's teachings. And it is said that they were also deeply concerned about the fact that Nichiren Daishonin had been persecuted throughout his life, and they were quite scared about the possibility of drawing persecution on themselves. No doubt also they may have been jealous of Nikko Shonin, who had been appointed Nichiren Daishonin's successor in no less than 3 different documents. So it was very clear that Nichiren Daishonin's will was that Nikko Shonin would succeed him. So, for all reasons, which I'll go into in more detail very shortly, it's very important that we understand these 26 warnings which were made by this great old priest 20 days before he died, because he wished to be sure that the heritage of the true law would be transmitted absolutely correctly into the future. That is the reason for his writing these. So I wish to go into them as thoroughly as I can possibly do so with you in the time that's available. So let's consider now why Nikko Shonin wrote these, and particularly why they are important to us today. So I think, first of all, through the issue with the priesthood, which we've been struggling with now for just about 2 years, many of us, many people have had to challenge their doubts. And as a resulting of challenging all sorts of different doubts that have risen up in various minds, we've grown a great deal in faith. Therefore, we should now understand the need for absolute strictness in terms and all matters of faith. This is our heritage. Every one of us has, since they chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, inherited the extremely vital mission of spreading these teachings and never ever allowing them to be distorted or to become impure. So I want to make sure you all understand at this point that in a sense these 26 articles are nothing new to us, because we have been, all of us, naturally heeding most of these articles, warnings, because we've been brought up thoroughly well in faith. And this, of course, goes back to Mr. Makiguchi, the first president of the Soka Gakkai, who from the very beginning was determined that everyone who practiced would practice absolutely purely as Nichiren Daishonin asked us to do. So through Mr. Makiguchi, second president, Mr. Toda, and Sensei, we've been brought up very well. And you'll find that when we go through these articles, in a sense, they're not new to us. So please don't panic and think, my goodness, does this mean I've been in some way going against 26 different warnings ever since I started to practice and really panic because of that? And the answer is no. I mean, one may have forgotten 1 or 2 points, but basically they're teaching us what we know already. But the important thing is that these 26 warnings were put in writing by no less a person in terms of faith than Nikko Shonin, the successor to Nichiren Daishonin, a person who, in fact, is the third of the 3 treasures of Buddhism. First treasure, of course, is the law. The second is the Buddha, who teaches the law. And the third, in the specific sense, is no one else but Nikko, Nikko, who succeeded Nichiren Shonin and was the first person, therefore, to spread the teachings. He's known sometimes as the great leader of the propagation of true Buddhism. Therefore, Nikko's place is revered in that way. Successive high priests after Nikko are not in the same category. This is exemplified in the doctrine of Nichiren Shoshu as it used to be before Nikken. This is exemplified by the fact that in the prayers of Gongyo, whereas you chant 3 Daimoku out loud towards Nikko Shonin in the third prayer, so far as Nichimoku Shonin, who was the next high priest, we only chant inside ourselves. The treasure of the priest is Nikko in a specific sense, and in a general sense, as you'll find in the Buddhist dictionary if you like to turn it up, in the general sense, the treasure of the priest is all of us, priests and lay people who with the utmost sincerity are spreading the teachings to others. Without that, of course, Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism would die. Therefore, as is taught in the principle of the person and the law would continue to lie in darkness without the person. Without the person to pass it from one generation to the next, it would die too. So therefore, the person is, as Nichiren Daishonin put it, since the law is respect-worthy, the person who spreads the law is also respect-worthy. So we are the guardians of the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin, particularly at this point in time, because the priesthood is collapsing. Of course, in the future, we will share that task with the priests once they have reformed themselves and established an effective priesthood once again. But that may take a long time. One has to remember that the priests are disgraced so far as the Japanese public is concerned, that every newspaper knows of all the things that have been happening. Therefore, it really is a major reform that they have to achieve, and this will take time. So the second point, that's the first point, why 26 warnings of Nikko are so important for us to understand at the moment. Because as it stands at the moment, we are the only people who can protect the purity of the teaching. Secondly, since the high priest and those who follow him have failed to abide by these 26 warnings, and in the process they've disgraced the name of Nichiren Shoshu, which of course the translation of which is the orthodox sect of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism. So because of this, its transmission to future generations and the reformation of the priesthood will become, in a sense, our responsibility. In due course, when Nikken has gone, which he will do, I think, fairly shortly, probably, then through our encouragement, those priests who did not fall under the spell of Nikken will need to receive our full and absolute encouragement in reforming themselves again. Another reason for the importance of us understanding these 26 warnings at this time is, of course, that the strictness with which we regard faith and the action of faith is a pillar of our future organization. So in those articles I wrote, which I hope you understood in the UK Express, when I gave my thoughts on a democracy of faith, you may remember that I think it was the sixth pillar, was strictness. That particular pillar I described as the fundamental principles of faith and practice of Nichiren Shonin's Buddhism, on which our organization, that is to say SGI, is founded, must be strictly maintained and protected. So when I said strictly, I mean strictly. Nichiren Shonin also in times in the Gosho uses the word strictly, and certainly he meant strictly too. So without this strictness in faith, I'm sorry to emphasize it again, but without this strictness in faith, I think we can all understand now, through the happening with the priesthood, that the whole movement of Kosen Rufu could be destroyed. Kosen Rufu would fail unless we carry forward and transmit to those we introduce to the practice and others who come in the future the importance of strictness in faith, right? And another reason, Sensei himself has just recently particularly emphasized the 26 warnings of Nikko Shonin. Just in the past a month or two, he lectured on them himself in Kyoto on the 24th of October. And then he arranged for President Akiya, president of the Soka Gakkai in Japan, to lecture to all of us on this subject when we went to Japan to attend the SGI General Meeting in November. So this emphasizes the fact that Sensei too believes that this is a most important time for us to really understand these 26 warnings. I think it's of interest to you, if you haven't already heard it, which you may have done, that at one evening during our visit to Japan last November, just a few weeks ago, Sensei, I think, surprised everybody by saying this. Well, this is the way I took it down. The issue with the priesthood of the Nichiren sect is over, he said. We have won a most important victory. We all know how evil the actions of Nichiren have been. Therefore, there is really absolutely no point in going on and on talking about them, unless in your country you have an established Danto group whose actions you must refute. Now, on the contrary, we must consolidate our strength and get underway our advance to the achievement of actual Kosen Rufu. Actually, the translation at the time was full-blown Kosen Rufu. Well, this was an incredible statement, because all the time I practice, Sensei has talked about establishing the foundations of Kosen Rufu. But this time he said full-blown Kosen Rufu, or words to that effect. So in other words, we are entering now the century of Kosen Rufu. I couldn't say any more than you exactly when it will be achieved, but we are entering now the era, as we approach this new century, of Kosen Rufu. So when Sensei says, we have won our victory, and he said it with such complete conviction, one understands, of course, that he is talking about what he knows through his Daimoku. So always, and I'm sure you've had leaders explain to you, always Sensei has said, if we have a great challenge, we have to go to the point of victory first. Somehow that sentence always ringing in my ears. You have to go to the point of victory first. He learned this when Mr. Toda gave him this enormous challenge in bringing into the movement for Kosen Rufu whatever enormous number of people it was in the area of Osaka called the Kansai during the time of Mr. Toda. And he had to battle with himself because he couldn't believe that he could, as it is called in a Buddhist country, and unfortunately too often here, to shakabuku well over 100,000 people in a space of 8 months. He couldn't believe it, but he battled with himself in front of the gonzen as he chanted Daimoku until it became a reality in his mind. Of course I can achieve it, because the power of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is limitless. When one breaks through like that in attacking a great problem, you have gone to the point of victory first. Once you've reached that point of victory first, and you know before, without a shadow of doubt, that you're going to win, whatever the problem may be in your lives that you're attacking, then, of course, through the wisdom of your Buddhahood, the way to actually get there in the actual reality of daily life will flow quite naturally into your mind. So this is what Sensei meant when he said that. Of that, there can be no doubt. And his statement was really uncompromising. We have won. So our study of the 26 warnings, or rather the fact that Sensei chose to talk about or lecture on the 26 warnings himself in Japan, is in a sense, I believe, like a sort of rounding off of what has proved to be a very unhappy phase of the movement for Kosen Rufu. But no doubt when we look back in the future, we shall realize how vital it was that we went through this battle and set our feet then firmly on the path of our mission towards full-blown Kosen Rufu. Sounds funny, full-blown, but I suppose it expresses it very well. So Mr. Toda, before Sensei, and Mr. Makaguchi before him, always placed the greatest possible importance on the 26 warnings. We've now, as it were, come of age and have to take these 26 warnings on board. Perhaps this is also emphasized that I discovered that within 3 months of being inaugurated president of the Soka Gakkai in 1960, Sensei gave a lecture to everybody then, just 3 months after his inauguration, on this particular subject, to 5,000 members who were attending a summer course at Taisekaji, the head temple. That was on the 8th of August, 1960. So I know some people wonder, when they've studied the 26 warnings, why the slander and the corruption of the teachings by the priests should have been allowed to go on for so long without remonstrations from leaders of the Soka Gakkai in Japan. And the answer is, of course, they did. If one really reads The Human Revolution, a book called The Human Revolution, then the whole story is told there. Mr. Makaguchi, I think that is well known, the fact that he had to remonstrate with the priests at the beginning of World War II because they had given in to the edicts of the military government to establish a Shinto shrine at Taisekaji in the head temple. They had also, the priests had demanded that the lay people of those times, not more than 3,000 of them, should obey the government and establish a Shinto shrine in their homes. Also, the government had insisted or tried to insist, and again, the priests had given in, that teachings should now incorporate certain aspects of Shinto, particularly emperor worship. And this should be incorporated in the Buddhist teachings. And Mr. Makaguchi flatly refused. It takes courage to do it. How many of us would have braved the wrath of the military government of Japan in those times, I wonder, and stood firm? Of course, at crucial times of crisis, somehow such amazing people appear. Another example of it was the persecution of Atsuhara and those 3 priests who were beheaded because they refused to give up teachings. So Mr. Makiguchi, Mr. Toda, absolutely both refused. Most of the other leaders, in the end, caved in, but not until the last 25 of them had been through a sort of brainwashing process in prison, which, of course, Mr. Makiguchi and Toda had to go through. Mr. Makiguchi, as you know, died in prison, but Mr. Toda lived and determined when he came out of prison that he would win a great struggle to spread the law in such a way that it could never again be attacked in the way it was then. So as it happens, Mr. Toda's prayers, in a sense, were granted because after World War II, first of all, 3 good high priests followed. Their names were the 64th high priest, whose name was Nisho, and particularly the 65th high priest, Nichiren, who was continuously consulted by Mr. Toda when he resuscitated the Soka Gakkai after World War II. And then the 66th high priest, the predecessor of Nikken, who was Nitatsu Shonin. So these high priests understood somehow the significance of the appearance of the Soka Gakkai, and therefore nurtured its growth. And indeed, Nichiren particularly discussed every matter together with Mr. Toda about how the Gakkai should be formed, and indeed including the necessity for the Gakkai to be a legal entity separate from Nichiren Shoshu and the head temple. In other words, Nichiren was well aware of the state of the priesthood. And of course, he would have been through that period in World War II when they betrayed the trust of Nichiren Daishonin and all previous disciples. Nichiren particularly understood that the Gakkai must be those bodhisattvas of the earth who, almost 3,000 or so years previously, Shakyamuni Buddha had predicted in the Lotus Sutra would appear in the early centuries of the latter day of the law. Suddenly, this movement appeared, so noble, so pure, directed by Mr. Makiguchi, whose diligence in keeping faith and in learning about faith was so great. And Nichiren particularly strongly supported them. And one must remember that this followed ghastly happenings in the head temple. When the high priest of those wartime days, when Mr. Makiguchi and Mr. Toda were in prison, was burnt to death, when part of the head temple was on fire, and the greatest possible depression descended on the priesthood generally. So both Mr. Toda and later Sensei were always hoping that these priests, particularly Nichiren and Nitatsu, would have the strength and indeed the cooperation and support from the priests to reform the priesthood. Meanwhile, they did their best to keep a good relationship with them, despite a growing amount of provocation. They felt that somehow things must go right. And in fact, Nitatsu Shonin, the 66th high priest, died sooner than was expected in 1978. And unfortunately, he died without putting in writing who was to be his successor. This was not unheard of. It had happened several times in the history of Nichiren Shoshin. And rightly or wrongly, by what procedure, I don't know, Nikken was declared by the priesthood to be the new high priest. So this was bitterly opposed at the time, about now 1979, that Nikken was inaugurated. It was bitterly opposed by a movement amongst the priesthood called Shoshinkai. Many of you have heard the name. Shoshinkai literally means correct faith group. And they argued against the right of Nikken to be the high priest. At that time, Sensei gave guidance that this, quite rightly, that this was a matter for the priesthood, that the lay people had no say in what goes on at the head temple, and that if it was Nikken who had been nominated and agreed to as high priest, then we must, as always, follow the guidance that was repeated by Mr. Makiguchi, Mr. Toda, the sensei. Our main task was to continue to protect the priesthood and the head temple, which is what we all, in those days, were brought up to do. So now, of course, looking back, one senses that this final blow-up with the priesthood, which finally came to a head 2 years ago, is actually necessary if the movement for Kosen Rufu is to have the slightest chance of advancing and growing in the years to come. I don't need to repeat the fact that in many ways the actions of the priesthood are quite medieval. Their desire under Nikken, those priests who followed him, was to establish a more and more authoritarian rule, which included the infallibility of the high priest Nikken. So one can't imagine any such organization being able to enter the coming century successfully when every other person in the whole world is clamoring for freedom and democracy. Of course, it would no more suit the times than one could possibly imagine. So enough talk from me now. Let's just begin to look at it, and we'll start by asking Robert to read the preface of the 26 Admonitions of Second High Priest Nikko Shonin.
The merciful sun of true Buddhism that spreads in the latter day illuminates the darkness of the extreme evil of slander, and the mystic wind of the Juryo chapter of Kuon blows away the gate of the provisional teaching that the Buddha achieved supreme enlightenment for the first time in Gaia. Ah, how rare it is to encounter the Buddhist law. It is as rare as to see the blossom of the Udumbara, or, for a one-eyed turtle, to find a floating sandalwood log with a hollow of just the right size to hold him. Nay, these cannot suffice to describe the difficulty of encountering the mystic law. We have fortunately been able to encounter this sutra, that is, the Gohonzon, due to a deep karmic connection. Accordingly, I will here set forth some articles for the sake of later students of Buddhism. This is solely because I treasure the Daishonin's golden words regarding Kosen Rufu.
So they're vigorous words, aren't they, for an 88 years old? I don't know what I'll be like when I'm 88. But he was vigorous and determined. You can tell that from the way he said it. So just to make sure everyone understands, the mystic wind of the Juryo chapter means, of course, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. The mystic wind of the Juryo chapter. Nam-myoho Renge Kyo of the three great secret laws. Secret because they had never been revealed before. Nichiren Daishonin did so. So those secret laws, just in case the people who don't quite understand that, are firstly the invocation of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, Daimoku. Secondly, the object of worship, which is the Gohonzon. And thirdly, the sanctuary in which the Gohonzon is enshrined, and which, therefore, is the focal point of the Buddha land which develops around each place of worship, each sanctuary, through the actions and the prayers and daimoku of each person. So the sanctuary in your own home is there where the Gohonzon is enshrined. And when you think about it, you begin to create a Buddha land around you. And if you hold a group meeting or something, probably people will feel, oh, this is an atmosphere that is really lovely. People come to Taplow Court and feel the same. They go to the Richmond Centre and feel the same. First thing most people say when they go to a discussion meeting, oh, maybe they say I didn't understand much of what they were talking about, but it was a lovely meeting and they were lovely people, isn't it? That is the creation of the Buddha land, the third of the three great secret laws: invocation, object of worship, and sanctuary, the focal point of the Buddha land. So Nikko Shonin, in this preface, explains his purpose very clearly. And also in the last final conclusion on the back page probably of your particular handout. So I'll just ask Robert to read the most important lines which give clearly the spirit and purpose of what Nikko, very easy to make a mistake there, what Nikko was really aiming to do.
From the preface, I will here set forth some articles for the sake of later students of Buddhism. This is solely because I treasure the Daishonin's golden words regarding Kosen Rufu.
The last three lines, those were, of the preface. Okay? And then if you look over to the conclusion, the first two lines especially, but I'll ask Robert to read the whole lot.
I have set forth these 26 articles for the sake of the eternal salvation and protection of humankind. Learned priests of later generations must not question these in the least. Those who violate even one of these articles cannot be called disciples of Nikko. To make this clear, I have formulated each of these precepts.
So it's very clear that these were for priests, but as we go through them fairly rapidly, because time is of the essence at this lecture, one will see that, of course, some of them were particularly for priests, but a lot of them completely apply to us as lay people because they concern the way or the spirit of our practice, that matter of strictness in faith. So he says, I have set forth these 26 articles for the sake of the eternal salvation and protection of humankind, emphasizing, of course, there that if the movement for Kosen Rufu collapsed because of a failure to be strict in faith, then this would be a disaster for the whole world. I think the reason for that is understandable. So up to the moment of his death, Nikko, who you might remember served his master from the age of 13 years old onwards, he shared most of Nichiren Daishonin's persecutions with him. At the time of the Atsahara persecution, he was a prime point in leading the movement to spread the teachings which led up to that persecution. And he was acknowledged as the person closest to his master, to Nichiren Daishonin. So he was determined, no matter what, in that 20 days before he died, to put something down which would ensure that Kosen Rufu would never fail, and that Nichiren Daishonin's will and testament, which was nothing else but the achievement of Kosen Rufu, would be achieved. This was his great spirit at that time. So as I said, he was already aware of what priests could do. He suffered himself under the 5 elder priests. He understood the fragility of the priesthood and that their understanding was often very shallow. People who, in those elder priests, sheltered under the umbrella of the master, leant against him, as it were, and the moment he died, collapsed completely. So Nikko was determined that he would ensure that the heritage of the true law would continue to be transmitted from person to person far into the future. So Sensei said in his lecture on the 26th warning, herein, he said, lies the original spirit of the correct school of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, as stated by Nikko Shonin. Those who violate even one of these articles, Nikko says, cannot be called disciples of Nikko. Yet, staggeringly, if you like to read through them and remember all you've read about what's going on in the priesthood, Nichiren has violated every single one of them. So, in the latest bulletin, I want to mention this because I think it's so important for everyone to read it. In the latest bulletin, there are 2 experiences by priests. The experiences, one is a letter of remonstration by a priest called Nishida, who just recently, a week or 2 ago, seceded from the head temple. That is a very moving statement from a compassionate man. And the other one is of particular interest to us in the West because it is the statement of the only foreigner, the only man from the West who has ever been, as far as I'm aware, ordained as a priest of Nichiren Shoshin. He was a Belgian man whose name was Claude Wouters, and he was ordained after going through training as a priest, learning the Japanese language and all that was necessary. And about 5 years ago, I think it was, he walked out of the head temple one day and never returned. And he gives his experience of what goes on amongst the priesthood in the head temple. And it certainly is remarkable reading. And of course, is expressed in the Western way by fellow European. So going back to the admonitions, as I say, though they were intended for priests, as bodhisattvas of the earth, we have to carry the banner now. This is just exactly, again, as Shakyamuni Buddha predicted in the Lotus Sutra. In those chapters containing the story or the allegory of the treasure tower and also the ceremony in the air. Words may not be exactly this, but Shakyamuni, as he tells this story, says, who will spread the true teachings in the dreaded age of now? The age we're in now. And all Shakyamuni's disciples said, we will. And if you remember pointing it out when we did the lecture on the true entity of life last year. And then Shakyamuni had to say to them, no, it's not you. You're not strong enough. These are the people who will spread the teachings in the dreaded age of Mappa. And at that moment, tens of thousands of people arose out of the ground. And as the sutra says, they were ordinary people. Yet they were possessed of great qualities and courage to withstand the privations and the sufferings and challenges of the age of Mappa, the age that we now all live in. Who else could it be but the Gakkai? Where else are the tens of thousands of people who've stood up and who are still standing up in more and more and greater numbers? as many as the sands of, I think it was 60,000 Ganges rivers. But Mr. Toda, of course, completely understood this. And in the last years of his life, he wrote a poem to the youth division in Japan. Sensei quoted this in his lecture. The poem said, "You young people, engraving in your hearts the 26 precepts, dedicate your lives to the path of the mystic law." You young people, engraving in your hearts the 26 precepts, dedicate your lives to the path of the mystic law. So as followers, as disciples of Nichiren Daishonin, as bodhisattvas of the earth, we too, all of us, should understand these principles, these articles, read them thoroughly, and make sure that we pass them on. As I said earlier, don't worry. You're mostly doing them already, abiding by them already, because of the way we were brought up in faith. But we need to make sure that they're passed on. So it's very important now that we should all engrave them in our hearts. So now let's have a look at them. There's no time to give a very long explanation, of course, and I'm sure you wouldn't want me to on all of 26 principles. So some will pass by fairly quickly, and some we'll deal with a little more thoroughly. But Robert will read, and I'll start to talk again. Okay? If you can stand it. Okay, off we go.
Article 1. The doctrines of the Fuji school must not differ in the least from the teachings of the late master.
So clear they are, you'll find, all the way through. This is obviously crucially important. Through the Gohonzon and the Gosho, through our Daimoku, if we haven't got a Gohonzon yet, and the Gosho, we each have a direct connection with Nichiren Daishonin and with the great law of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. I cannot overemphasize this point. We have a direct connection, and individually we have to defend with our whole lives that direct connection. Because what the priesthood, what Nichiren has been trying to do, is to break that connection and stand between each of you and me and Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, as he viewed it. This is totally against what Nichiren Daishonin taught. Even recently, he said that what is the Gosho of these days is his guidance. But the Gosho of provisional teachings in this age was unbelievable. He is standing, trying to stand between, trying to weave his way in, if you like, and stand between you and the Gongs and the Gosho. You have the Gosho. Mr. Toda saw to that. One of the first things he did after the war when he came out was to ask a retired high priest to help him to compile the Gosho in one volume. You'll never see a Japanese member walking to a meeting without the Gosho. Never. How fortunate we are that he took these steps so that you and I and all of us can stand alone, directly related with Nichiren Daishonin and the law, through our practice and through the fact that we can chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, and we are entitled to have the Gohonzon in our own homes. This is priceless, isn't it? It's just incredible. How can Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism exist without that? We immediately would become like many religions, where the priest stands between you and the object of worship. You have to go through a priest in order. You have to go on your knees before a priest before you can go directly to the object of worship. Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism is based totally on equality. that each one of us has the Buddha state within us, and that each one of us has access to those things that he taught would enable us to activate our Buddha state. That is the Gohonzon and the Gosho. So the slightest sign in the future of that trying to be taken away from us in some way, whether it's within the lay society or whether it's by the priesthood of the future, must be crushed, because you are losing your right as a human being in the eyes of Nichiren Daishonin. This is the point that's at stake in this whole battle that's gone on over these last 2 years. So then Article 2.
Article 2. The doctrines of the 5 senior priests differ in every regard from the teachings of the late master.
Well, you could put in there the name Nichiren in place of the 5 senior priests. The doctrines of Nichiren differ in every regard from the teachings of the late master. Let's pass that by and go to the next one.
Article 3. There will, in the future, appear persons who slander our school, saying that the Gosho are forged writings. You must not associate with such evil priests.
Well, of course, as I said already, Nikko had already been through the struggle over the 5 elder priests. Amongst other things, the 5 elder priests rejected, after Nichiren Daishonin had died, not while he was living, after he died, they rejected all those Gosho that were written in the writing of the common people. They only accepted the Gosho that were written in classical Chinese characters, because they felt ashamed that their master should have written in the characters that the people understand, and not in the scholarly custom of using Chinese characters. So, of course, Nichiren Daishonin had written in the characters that the common people should understand, because what he was teaching was available to everyone, including the common people, above all to the common people. So it was very similar in Europe. Scholars in Europe wrote everything in Latin and Greek in medieval times. In that way, they preserved their exclusivity, you understand. The common people couldn't read what they wrote. Interestingly enough, I don't know if there are any doctors here, but doctors always used to write their prescriptions in Latin at one time too, when I was a boy. I don't think they do it anymore. But anyway, they say that was actually, so you shouldn't understand the prescription and try to make the medicine yourself. But I sometimes wonder. Anyway, what this article is saying is we must always be on the side of the ordinary people, isn't it? That's really the point. We must always be with the ordinary people of this world, and never, ever wrap Nichiren Daishonin's teachings up in a load of jargon or mysticism. Some people love mysticism. If they get a chance to make something appear sort of mystic and creepy, they seem to like to do it. But Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism isn't creepy. It's incredibly straight and clear. Okay, on to Article 4.
Article 4. Those who produce forged writings and say that they are Gosho, or who practice with the view that the essential and theoretical teachings of the Lotus Sutra are the same, are parasites in the lion's body.
Well, that's so clear, isn't it? Everything has to be based on the Gosho, not, as Nichiren said, on his guidance. Sensei's guidance, if you like to probe into it, you will always find that it's based totally on the Gosho. And of course, he does use many Gosho quotations in the process of giving it. So the purpose of our chapter study, of course, is to understand the Gosho in contemporary terms. The purpose of Sensei's guidance also is that we should understand the Gosho in the contemporary terms used in ordinary daily life. So that is why we have chapter study, and why we should really struggle to go to it. Article 5.
You should refrain from indulging in poetry or non-Buddhist works, or from engaging in idleness and chatter without having the aim of rebuking slander.
Well, there is a Gosho, which Sensei quoted in his lecture, which I'll read to you, which perhaps explains that. It's a Gosho in volume 3, page 215, and it reads as follows. Though one may have been fortunate enough to be born as a human being, if he fails to study Buddhism and to refute its slanderers, but simply spends his time in idleness and chatter, then he is no better than an animal dressed in priestly robes. That was what Nichiren Buddhism said. Very clear. In other words, of course, that doesn't stop us all from enjoying ourselves and going out and so on. But we have to find a balance and make sure that also our daily life includes our Buddhist practice and a little bit of Buddhist study. That we shouldn't let frivolous things get in the way of that balance and throw us off course. That's really what is meant by that. So I know you all try hard to keep a balance in your life. So I don't think there's anything to fear in that. Now let's go on.
Article 6. Lay believers should be strictly prohibited from visiting heretical temples and shrines. Moreover, priests should not visit slanderous temples or shrines which are inhabited by demons, even if only to have a look around. To do so would be a pitiful violation of the Daishonin's Buddhism. This is not my own personal view. It wholly derives from the sutras of Shakyamuni and the writings of Nichiren Daishonin.
So please understand in this article that Nikko Shonin is writing about Buddhist priests of Nichiren Shoshu, who live solely in a Buddhist country. There was no Sokugakai International in those days. Therefore, what he's talking about is Buddhist other sects, Buddhist temples, which of course Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism would view as heretical. So as lay people, we don't have to be too concerned about that. Even as a foreigner, we may be taken by somebody if we go to Japan to a heretical temple. But as long as we keep chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo and don't give offerings, that's the important point. So in the custom in Japan, anyone who goes to a temple, a Buddhist temple, has to make an offering. But as a foreigner, you're always excused. In other words, what the Japanese do, who go to a heretical temple, is very simple. They put their hands together and clap them, I think it's 3 times, and then they chuck a penny or so into the offering bowl or box or whatever it may be. This is their respect to that temple. But as a foreigner, you don't have to do it because you can always, appear to be mystified about what everyone's doing. Anyway, the important point is that you visit such a place as a museum, basically, and that is all they are. What you'll actually find in most of them is that all the objects there, and there are some very ancient objects, are all smothered in dust, and the place hasn't been cleaned, and the priests usually look dirty, and it's really, not very exciting. Actually, I had to take 2 guests from England of senseis round Kyoto not long ago, about two years ago, and it was so depressing, I can't tell you. We went to one after another of these temples. So everyone we went into, I was saying Nam-myoho Renge-kyo inside me. And when I came out, I cleared the air by chanting inside myself. Of course, I couldn't do it in front of these people I was accompanying. But they were so dirty and so depressing and so dark and so smelly. I cannot tell you. I mean, in those days, of course, it was over 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, Taisekaji was still looked after by the Sokugakai. And it was so incredible to get there. It's so bright. And these two people I've been taking round immediately noticed the difference. And really, actually, through that, really understood what an incredible thing SGI must be. So anyway, that was my experience. So I hope that's clear. You don't want to make a heavyweight thing about this. And mostly it's about what priests do. Quite obviously, for a priest to go into a heretical temple is an odd thing to do, bearing in mind what Nichiren Buddhism taught about heretical sects. But as you know, Nikko Shonin staggered everyone 18 months ago by going to a Zen cemetery and conducting a memorial service for his father, I think it was. And he'd left his father in this Zen cemetery. Incredible thing. I would have taken my father out and put him somewhere else. Okay.
Article 7. Disciples of ability should be allowed to devote themselves to the study of the Gosho and other doctrines of Buddhism without being pressed to perform miscellaneous services for their teachers.
Well, that's an incredible thing for me because young priests, it's been reported in recent times, their experience of Taiseki over many years is that they only had 8 hours of Gosho study in a whole year, in each year. And I once asked the senior priest, a man called Reverend Maikawa, who came to do Gojukai here, and I said to him, he'd been a priest since he was an acolyte as a young boy. And I said, God, how incredible it must be studying and learning the Gosho at such an early age. I was all enthusiastic when I was talking to him. And he looked at me as if I was with a sort of blank stare, and he said, I don't understand what you mean, Mr. Corson. So I repeated it, and he said, no, he said, no, none of the young priests or do any form of Gosho study until they're well into their 20s. And he said their job is to serve their seniors, and that's what they do. So, of course, that's something else that I guess has to be changed. Okay?
Article 8. Those of insufficient learning who are bent on obtaining fame and fortune are not qualified to call themselves my followers.
I think that's straightforward. No need to dwell on it. Sensei is always saying to us, if all you're thinking about is fame and fortune, inevitably, you'll come a cropper because you merely encourage the poisons of greed and anger. Right?
Article 9. Until they are well versed in the difference between the provisional and true teachings, followers of later generations should visit this temple.
That's Taiseki.
Setting aside the debt of gratitude they owe to their parents and teachers, and undertake various studies in order to free themselves from the sufferings of birth and death and attain the way.
So that's really, in our terms, going on courses. You struggle to go on courses, you save money to go to TRETS, or if there's a vacancy, to go to Japan. Nowadays, you can also get away, if you can get away from work, and you plan it all to go to Tapler Court on a course. That is an incredible cause to make. That's what Nikko Shonin is really pointing out here. An amazing cause to make, for which you will earn benefit. Okay?
Article 10.
And 11.
Unless you have a thorough understanding of and firm faith in the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin, you should not study Tiantai's doctrines. Article 11. Followers of this school should engrave the teachings of the Gosho in their lives, and thereby inherit the ultimate principles expounded by the master. Then, if they have any leisure time, they should inquire into the doctrine of the Tiantai school.
In other words, we shouldn't dabble about in other things until we've really got Nichiren Daishonin's teachings solidly in our lives. Then you can look at what Tiantai taught and what other people taught. Of course, that doesn't apply to those principles of Tiantai's which Nichiren Daishonin incorporated in his teachings. Do you all understand? Okay?
Article 12. You should be inclined to engage in discussion or deliver lectures on Buddhism and you should refrain from pursuing secular concerns.
Well, there is, again, to remind you, to priests, we have to be involved in secular concerns. So our struggle, quite obviously, is to maintain a balance between our Buddhist activities and our secular activities in the reality of our daily lives. Okay?
Article 13. Until Kosen Rufu is achieved, propagate the law to the full extent of your ability without begrudging your life.
Yes, please. Clear? Right?
Article 14. As for practitioners who treasure the law more highly than their own lives, even if they are but humble teachers of the law, you must hold them in great esteem, revering them as you would the Buddha. Article 15. You should revere a teacher of the law who engages in its propagation as a sacred priest, even though he may be your junior. Article 16. Even though they may be lowly, you should deeply respect and regard as your teachers those whose understanding of Buddhism surpasses your own.
So this for us includes, of course, those who devotedly lecture to you, including me. But I mean, of course, all of us who try our best to lecture, a chapter study, or on this sort of level, everyone is trying their utmost. And you can definitely learn something from everybody. But if you sit during the lecture, I hope no one's doing it here, if you sit during the lecture criticizing the person all the time and thinking, oh, what a rotten lecture he is, or she is, I could do better than him, well, of course you don't learn anything because your mind's totally occupied in these criticisms. So it's a very big point, this. And of course, it can be dangerous if people have such an attitude. So what really they're saying is anyone who is trying to pass on something about the Buddhist teachings is worthy of respect. And we should respect that person. And if our eyes and if our ears are open properly through respecting them, no matter who it is, and no matter how rotten a lecturer he is, how unprofessional he may be, you definitely can learn something from it. So that's a big point for us all, I think. Okay, we're going to have to stop in about a minute or two.
Article 17. Do not follow even the high priest if he goes against the Buddha's law and propounds his own views.
Well, nothing could be clearer than that, could it? Okay, 18.
Even if a view is set forth unanimously by a conference of believers, the high priest should repudiate it if it goes against the Buddha's law.
This is interesting. I'll just read you quickly Sensei's comment on that. The basic point, he said, is that truth or falsity should be determined neither by authority, i.e. by the high priest, for example, nor by the weight of the view of the multitude, i.e. by a conference or gathering of believers. In all matters, what counts most is whether or not something accords with the correct Buddhist teaching. And it goes without saying that the Daishonin's golden words are the standard that is to be used in making any such determination. So that's very, very clear. And this is interpreting, of course, what Nichiren is stating clearly here. Okay? What we must be, Nikko, sorry, what we must be sure of is that nothing goes against the teaching, right?
Article 19. Black robes should not be worn by priests. We can leave
those out because they're about priestly robes. Both that one and the next one. They shouldn't wear black robes because other sects do. And the other Japanese word there means unnecessarily ornamental clothes, right?
Article 21. You should not sit together with slanderers of the law at religious ceremonies for fear of suffering the same punishment as they.
Well, that again is talking about religious ceremonies in a Buddhist country. You can go and sit in a Christian church. Of course, you should chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, not allow yourselves to be mesmerized by glorious choirs singing and all that. You can sit there, and when everyone's praying, you can chant inside yourself. When they're singing hymns, you can chant out loud. All right? Please don't think that you cannot go to church or a synagogue if there is some sort of family gathering or some necessity for you to go there, because otherwise you would hurt your parents or your brothers and sisters or whatever. There's no rule against that.
Article 22. You must not accept offerings from slanderers of the law.
So we shouldn't accept offerings from anyone except members. Right?
Article 23. Carrying a sword or staff in order to protect the Buddhist law is permissible. However, weapons should not be worn when presiding over religious services, though accompanying priests may be permitted to carry them to protect themselves and others.
Well, we hope we never have to do that. All right?
Article 24. At religious ceremonies, young acolytes should not occupy seats lower than those of high-ranking lay followers.
The meaning behind that, as Sensei explained in his lecture, is that priests and for that matter lay people, shouldn't fawn on those who are able to make big contributions to the Kosen Rufu Fund, for example. They're treated like every other believer, because after all, it's anyone who is very generous will get great benefit from the Gonzen. So they don't have to be put in an exalted place. In the old church of my days, the Church of England, people used to rent their pews that they sat on. So the rent, of course, you expected to make a big donation. And that was disgraceful. So those people who were wealthy got a front seat, and everyone else was piled at the back. Awful. Okay?
Article 25. My disciples should conduct themselves as holy priests, patterning their behavior after that of the late master. However, even if a high priest or a priest striving for practice and understanding should temporarily deviate from the principle of sexual abstinence, he may still be allowed to remain in the priesthood as a common priest without rank.
So this deals, of course, with celibacy. All priests in Nichiren Daishonin's days were celibates, didn't marry. All priests in Japan didn't marry until, for some unknown reason yet to be grasped, the Emperor Meiji, when he was restored to the throne of Japan, the imperial throne, said to all the priests, "Why don't you get married now?" he said, or something like that. And they all rushed off to do it. So I'm afraid time is up. I think we've covered everything that we should. You've already heard the last words, the conclusion, and we're a little bit late now. And we have to clear the hall very quickly. I'm sorry to go over time, but it's one of those things we couldn't stop in the middle of it, isn't it? So thank you very much for your close attention. Many thanks.